得了广泛影响。本次讲座主题“失去的权利：中国产业公民身份的兴衰”，主要内容来自于安州教授2019年的新书《Disenfranchised: The Rise and Fall of Industrial Citizenship in China》。该书通过对50余家工厂工人、干部等的访谈以及详实的资料梳理，系统分析了新中国成立70年来中国工业企业中工厂政体和工人身份所发生的变化。相信本次讲座，安州教授会为我们提供关于这一历史变化过程新的认识和理解。同时，我们有幸再次邀请了杨和平老师作为语坛人。小镇读书会十分感谢安州和杨和平2位老师对于本次讲座的支持。最后，听众如有相关建议，可以会后联系我们。希望各位听众注意讲座纪律，保持发言秩序，保护在线会议。那么，时间交给安州和杨和平2位老师。
Well, hello everyone. I'd first like to thank you for inviting me to give this talk about my recent book, and I'd like to thank Yan Хэpina for helping translate.
好，感谢大家
Thank
参加这
everybody
个会议，感
who's
谢
tuned in.
邀请。You can say that in Chinese.
Okay, today I'm going to be talking about my recent book, Disenfranchised: The Rise and Fall of Industrial Citizenship in China. It's
今天
based
我
on
要
what I've been doing
one
for the
sentence at a
last
time.
10 years, about really the last 70 years of changes in industrial relations in China.
今天我要讲我那本书啊，就是产业公民身份的这个政治那个刚才那本书，你看我记不住，这是关于中国70年来的这个变化。
I'd like to actually start not in China, but on a global level, with the whole era that followed the Second World War through the 1980s, which I call the global era of industrial citizenship.
Let me translate. Otherwise, I won't remember. Okay, sorry about that. 我呢，从开始不是从中国开始，我想给大家有一个全球化的这个全球的视野，就是从2战以后到80年代整个全球工业这个情况。
Okay, during this whole period, this period of industrial citizenship, workers had long-term job tenure. Workers in many countries, in many factories, in many enterprises had long-term job tenure.
这一段时间呢，2战以后到80年代很多地方全球性的就是工人有这个长期用工制度。
And they were considered, they not only had long-term job tenure, but they were considered legitimate stakeholders in the factories in which they worked.
而且他们也被看作为是一个有权益的值得保护的这么一个参与者，在企业里边。
And they enjoyed extensive influence. They often enjoyed extensive influence inside factories.
他们往往也在这个企业内部有很大的这个影响力。
The photo here is of a factory council in Italy during this period.
这个是照片呢，是这个意大利的一个工人代表大会的一个现场。
Okay. This period, workers were often highly organized through both trade unions and through works councils.
工人也说，是高度组织起来的，有这个要么是工会，要么是职工代表大会制度。
Now, some of these were more autonomous. They were organized by the workers themselves, and they were controlled to a large extent by the workers themselves.
有很多是自发的或是自主的他们自己组织起来作为工会或者什么团体，对。
Others were organized by management, the factory management, or by the state.
另外一些呢是要么是这个工厂管理层资方组织的工人的这种参与这个管理的这个机制，要么是国家出面组织工人去管理国家的一种机制。
In either case, workers had, even in the case where they were organized by the state or by management, workers often had enjoyed substantial influence. These were venues for workers' influence.
不论是这个自发的、自主的，还是厂方组织的，还是国家组织的这个工人都享受着 比较高的这个参与权、主人公地位。
Yeah. During this period, workers were considered industrial citizens. In China, they were called 主人翁。
在这个时期呢，工人呢被看成是一个工业公民产业公民他们是这个在中国呢作为一个单位的人。Is that what you're saying? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. And there were, throughout this period, workers had aspirations of industrial democracy.
整个这一段时间呢，工人有一种就是工业民主的志向。
Now, this was never fully realized anywhere, but workers often had substantial power within the factories.
但是这也从来没有真正实现过，它只是一个愿望没有完全实现。对。
But they often had substantial power, nevertheless.
但是他们还是确实有不可忽略的这个影响力有实质性的。
Now, all of these ideas, the ideas of industrial citizenship and ideas of industrial democracy, originated in Europe in the early 20th century.
这种工业这个民主产业民主公民身份呢，是从这个20世纪这个从欧洲那边开始发起的。
And they were later extended to the developing world, to many countries in the developing world. And this includes both capitalist and socialist countries.
所以这些推广到了一些这个发展中国家了，是不管是资本主义的还是社会主义国家，都开始有这种现象。
Stronger in the socialist countries.
当然在社会主义国家里边呢，工人的地位当然要更高了，更强烈，它民主管理的这个更现实。对。
But the ideas of industrial citizenship and the actual powers that the workers had were severely eroded with the rise of neoliberalism, starting in the 1980s and becoming strong in the 1990s.
但是这个产业公民的这种制度或者这种身份呢，随着新自由主义的兴起呢，就严重的被剥夺了，被削弱。从80年代开始吧，到90年代，对。
Now, my book is exclusively about China. It's about
但是我那本书呢
industrial citizenship in China first, and then the fall of industrial citizenship in China.
但是我那本书呢是完全是讲的是中国的事儿，讲的是这个Why do you have my name and number on it? That's bad. You have a background there.
我不知道。
I don't know how that happened. That's
I'm saying mine.
Hey, 这个我的电话这个that's terrible.
So
how do I do that? Everybody has their own, but nobody else. 就说okay. I'm sorry. I see my own watermark on my screen.
Yeah, 我看不见. I don't see it.
Okay, all right. Scare me. I said you 吓坏我了。这个水印把我吓死了。
So what the book is about is really 70 years of industrial changes in industrial relations in China from 1949 revolution until the present.
OK, 就是说这本书呢就讲的是这个中国的工人的他的这个地位，这个产业公民的这个身份，从他的兴起到他衰落。
And what I do in the book is compare two eras. The first era could be called the era of the work unit system. That's from the 1950s to the 1980s. And then beginning in the 1990s through the present, it might be called the era of the modern enterprise system.
这个可以把这个分成这个两个时代一个是这个就是单位制度，从50年代到80年代是这个单位制度 但是这个从那以后呢，90年代到今天，是一种就是所谓的现代企业制度。
Okay. The transition from one era to the other, from the work unit system to the modern enterprise system, the transition has been called industrial restructuring.
这种改变呢，美名其曰是国企改制。
Yeah. Now, most research on industrial restructuring in China has looked at the economic impact of this restructuring. My research focused on the political impact.
对，一般学者对这个时期的研究呢，总是基本上从经济的角度来看它啊。我呢是比较注重于这个政治上的影响。
Yeah. Really, what I'm looking at is the changing power relations between workers and managers.
我关注的就是这个领导和被领导之间的权力关系。工人和企业管理者的关系。
Yeah. Now, the whole discussion about this industrial relations especially during the work unit era, has been set by a very, very influential book by Andrew Walder called Communist Neo-Traditionalism.
这个话题最有影响力的是一个作者叫中文叫魏扬德吧，杨德就是说，他这个是共产主义社会的新传统主义他呢这个在学界影响非常大。我呢主要是对付他这种说法的。
Yeah, and he initiated this debate about the relationship between job tenure and dependency and power in factories in China.
他呢主要是探讨就是说这个这个 tenure 这个怎么就是说永久how do you translate that to make sure it's clear?
Job tenure or dependency?
No, depends on no, but tenure 就是说一个工作保障和tenure versus what? Power 对就业保障和这个权利和依附关系，长期任职对吧
？Right. And he advanced a powerful argument. He argued that permanent employment and workplace provision of welfare led to dependency.
他呢他的这个强有力的一种说法就是说，这个就业保障和就业的这个福利制度造成一种强烈的依附关系。
And to break this dependency, he argued, he published this book in the mid-1980s, in 1986. To break this dependency, he said that the system of permanent job tenure had to be ended.
要这个打破这种依附关系呢，就必须终结这个终身就业制度。That's neoliberalism. That's neoliberalism.
Exactly. The beginning of it. Other scholars have contested his view. They've argued that secure job tenure in China enhanced workers' power.
其他的学者讲呢，这个巩固的就业其实增加了这个工人的权利，企业的权利。
These are Qingquang Li, Elizabeth Perry, Jonathan Unger, Anita Chan, Huayin Li, and Liu Feng.
就是说很多这些学者比如说李庆俊呢，这个裴一礼这是哪个学校翻的？裴一礼都有名的，对吧？好多这些人大家看得见 ，everybody can see the name list. I don't
know. However, most of these scholars have focused on recent years. They focused on the post-industrial restructuring period, and they only look back on the work unit system as a kind of background, a context to discuss what's happened in recent years. While a couple of Haiyin Li and Liu Feng, they looked at the work unit era, but they didn't really go on to examine what's happened since then.
这些学者呢，基本上是从这个 改开以后呢，90年代就是他们对这个过去的单位制度呢是一种轻妙的不怎么研究的，他们只是研究是这个从90年代以后的 ，Am I right？
对啊，
对啊，所以他们对过去的这个单位制度呢，基本上嗤之以鼻吧，就是不怎么没怎么看好啊。
不一定。
不一定啊 ，OK，
Just didn't do the research on it. That wasn't what they were
说错了，就是说他们没有对这个过去单位制度做研究啊。那
On the
我
other
呢
hand,
就是
Bai Li and Lu Feng, their research was about the work unit era. They didn't so much look at, they haven't looked at yet the period after the work unit era restructuring.
Oh, I'm confused. So some did work on the work unit era, but they didn't compare to the post. Some did
Exactly.
the post didn't compare to before. That's your point.
Exactly.
OK，
Yes.
那我说错了，就是说有些学者呢，光研究这个单位制度，没有研究后来的变化；有些学者只是研究后来的变化，没有研究单位制度。
Yeah. So what I do in this book is I really compare the two eras.
所以我呢是把两个时期做对比来研究的。
Now, my main focus is on the work unit era because that's what I was most interested in, looking back at the Mao era in the 1980s. But I also then look at what's happened with industrial restructuring.
我呢主要是研究这个毛泽东时代的和那个80年代的这个单位制度，当然也做了一些这国企改制以后的情况。
So part of what I do in this book is I introduce a conceptual framework that we can use to analyze these changes. And the conceptual framework uses two key factors that help determine power inside factories.
我提出一个概念呢，就是从这个工人的身份制度和他的自主权这两个视角从这儿来去分析这样子。
The first is workplace membership or citizenship. This is under conditions in which the enterprise really becomes something of a polity, a political entity, and workers become members and legitimate stakeholders in this polity.
就是说这个工人这个在这个工厂里的身份这里边就是一个工厂里边的政治了，就是他在这个政治里边的这个身份有多大。Is that what it means?
Yeah.
Sort of. Okay.
The other aspect, the other factor, very important factor is autonomy. And I'll explain more about what I mean by that in a bit.
第二个视角呢，就是从他的自主权的视角来看第一个视角呢，就是说工厂成分OK， 然后他会解释自主权到底什么意思。
And my basic premise is that you need both workplace membership and autonomy in order to establish any kind of workplace democracy.
我这个基本出发点就是说，工厂内部的民主必须有两个结合，一个是身份，一个是自主权，两个不可或缺。
Now, these are not dichotomous variables. These are both continuous variables. You can go from very low levels to very high levels and everywhere in between. For both of these.
这些这个你从那个工人那个职工的自主权的维度，还是从那个工厂成分身份的维度，这都不是二元的，它都是多元的，它是一个光谱，它从最低到最高都是连续的。
Now, for workplace membership, for example, you can go from very high levels of membership rights, where you're considered full members of the workplace or the work unit. You have a strong claim to your job, and you're considered legitimate stakeholders.
这里边呢，从这个身份角度来看的话，你可以是一个非常这个稳固的就业的这个程度，对吧？你是完全是这个企业里边的这个利益相关的一部分。
or to very, very low levels of membership rights where you can be hired and fired at will.
或者是你完全什么权利都没有，人家想开除你就开除你，随时可以开除你从这个所以呢，就业的这个稳固性从一点权利都没有到完全就是铁饭碗shall I say 铁饭碗 that would be the good extreme, right?
Yep. On the other factor, autonomy in the workplace, you can go from very low levels where you have very coercive, highly coercive labor relations. You don't really have any right to collectively organize, and there's little room for self-management.
这个自主权的这个里边呢，从最低端呢，就是说你任何组织工会组织工人权利都没有。
To very high levels of autonomy, in which you would have substantial rights to organize collectively. You end up negotiating labor relations, and you have substantial room for self-management.
到另外一个极端呢，就是你有这个不可剥夺的这个组织权利、协商权利，去协商这个劳资关系充分的自我管理空间。
Now, the combination of these two, they can be combined in different ways and to different extents. And so the combination, you end up with different kinds of factory regimes.
所以呢，这里边呢，你可以这两个纬度有无穷个不同的组合
Yeah. If you combine low levels of membership rights with low levels of autonomy, you get what's often called market despotism, where the factory managers and the factory owners completely control what goes on, and workers have very little power and very few rights.
所以你想想，一个身份没有任何保障的工人和他没有任何自主权的结合到一起呢，就是完全是市场专制的那种场面。
An example would be a high turnover electronics factory in China today, or such as Foxconn, or in many other countries.
这种例子呢，就是很多那个人员流动非常快的、非常高的大家比较熟悉的一些企业或者单位。
If you get a combination of low levels of autonomy, but high levels of workplace membership, you get a system of paternalism.
如果你有一个这个身份，就是工作岗位的非常稳固的但是并没有这个自主权的这么一个结合那么你就是一个非常家长式的管理的企业单位。
An example would be a company town. Throughout the history of capitalism, there's been company towns like this, which everything, the power is in the hands of the company, but people have long-term employment.
这种例子呢，就是在西方比较多的，就是说一个小城镇或者小地方，就一个雇主，大家都是为那个地方干活的。比如说I can raise some example like a coal mining or a steel mill or something like that. 就比如说一个煤矿然后呢它周围都是这个矿主雇工职业都是比较稳定的，但是一点自主权都没有。或者一个就像小地方的一个大企业，那它就是地方的这个家长式的管理。
If you have low levels of membership rights, you have a lot of transition workers come and go, but you have a high levels of autonomy in the workplace, you get what I call a regime, a factory regime of individual autonomy, or a workplace regime of individual autonomy.
如果你有一个这个就业毫无保障，但是呢有高度自主权的这么一个结合的话，就是一个我称它为个人自由的、个人自治的这么一种情况。
And an example might be the situation of engineers in a software development firm.
这种例子呢，就像这个一些这个个体户，比如说搞软件搞这个媒体开发软件这样的工程师 Would doctor be like that type too, or something like that? Self-employed accountant?
Not self-employed, they might be contract. They might be contract workers. But they enjoy a lot of autonomy. They have a high level of marketplace power.
就这种的个体户呢，他在市场上有很大的这个自主权，他可以这个讨价还价。
And even inside the workplace, they often have a lot of control over their own work.
即便是在这个工作单位里边，他们也有很大的自主权。
Now, if you get a combination of high workplace membership rights and autonomy in the workplace, those are the conditions that allow for workplace democracy.
如果你既有这个就业的这个保障铁饭碗，又有高度的自主权，那你就实现了职工的民主制度。
An example might be a workers' collective, where everybody is a member and you get to vote on how things are organized in the workplace.
比如说这里边呢，就是工人自治的这些企业或者单位。
So, combination of workplace membership and autonomy in the workplace, the level can lead to very different types of factory regimes.
所以这种四种结合，两个视角的不同的结合，会给我们造成很多就业的这个场所。
Yeah. So, like I say, I think this conceptual framework can be applied to workplaces around the world, but my research was exclusively about China, factories in China.
所以我这个理论框架呢，可以适用在任何这个工厂，世界任何地方的工厂的环境里边。但是我这个主要是研究中国的这个工厂的情况。
And China is a particularly good example to analyze the changes in this type of relationships between these two factors, because the changes have been so dramatic, so tremendously different
中国的是
between
一
the
个
Mao era
研
and the
究这
current
个问
era.
题的最好的场所，因为这两个视角的变化是非常大的，所以它提供了一个完美的一个实验室一个田野。
My sources were, the most important sources were interviews with workers and cadres in over 50 factories in China.
我的这个资料来源于采访这个50多家的这工厂里的工人和干部。
I also looked at newspapers, both official newspapers, papers published by the government, but also by factories, and also official factory gazetteers and factory documents.
而且我也参照了这个不光是官方的媒体报纸，我也看到了企业的或者是文革中的一些各种小报之类的。
But also I looked at
还有长治OK.
Zhangzhe as well. Go ahead.
Right.
But also the publications published by the factions during the Cultural Revolution, which were somewhat more autonomous.
还有一些就是文革中的一些小报，他们是非常这个有自主的、自发的这个内容。
Okay. Today I'm only going to be able to give you a brief synopsis of the central narrative of the book, not get into
今
too
天我
many.
只能有机会有时间把这个书的概要简单的介绍一下。
Yeah. But I would welcome your questions if you would like to ask about more details.
当然你可以提更多的问题了。
I'll start my narrative in 1948. That's when I started. When the Communist Party began taking over factories in China, even before it came to power nationally. And this period
这个
was
叙事呢，从48年开始，即便是在中华人民共和国还没建立以前，但是在好多共产党呢就开始组织工人去管理这个企业。
During this period, this first period, during the 1950s, the Communist Party was taking over the factories in China from the capitalists and the old regime managers. And they mobilized workers. They sent a small number of party cadres. These were very small number of cadres that were typically veteran revolutionaries. They were typically peasants. they sent them into factories to mobilize the workers against the capitalists and the old regime managers.
就是说共产党开始到改造这些过去的国民党或者资本家的或者是买办的企业，他们就派了几个这个党代表，这些人呢，往往就是过去是农民啊，他们到工厂里边去，就动员工人去反对资本家。
The first thing they did was build shop floor party organizations inside the factory. They recruited a number of workers that they considered most sympathetic and most trustworthy, and they recruited them into the party. All workers. The party organization was typically all workers.
他们首先在工厂里边发动群众以后，把一些先进工人组织起来，成立党小组这些全是工人。
And then they use these party organizations to mobilize all of the workers and to organize them into unions and into the trade union and into the staff and workers congresses.
所以他们通过党小组把工厂里所有的工人动员起来，成立工会成立职工代表大会。
And then during this period, during the 1950s, they systematically promoted workers to leadership positions, taking these positions from the capitalists and the old regime managers.
他们是推荐工人到各基层的领导岗位上。
During this period, workers became permanent members of the work units. That's very different in the past. In the past, they'd been hired and fired at will. Now they were permanent work unit members.
这时候呢，工人获得了这个铁饭碗的这个地位他不像过去那样子随便被解雇开除变成了有了铁饭碗了。
In fact, often as time wore on, even their children became work unit members. Sometimes their spouses became work unit members. They settled down, they lived in the work units, and it became strong communities that had long-standing communities.
随着时间的推移，甚至他们的子女、妻子、夫人、丈夫等等，都变成企业单位里的人了而且单位里边整个社会服务全在一块儿，它变成了一个单位人了，它不是这个一个社会人，而是一个单位的人。
At the same time, and for the same reason, there was little mobility among work units.
所以这也造成了这个工人在单位之间的流动是非常少的。
These work units are characterized by remarkably egalitarian distribution.
这个里边的这个分配呢是相当平均的就是平等是比较很普遍的。
There was still inequality, but compared with before 1949 or in recent years or in almost any other country in the world, it was remarkably egalitarian.
虽然有差异，但是呢，相对于解放前或者相对于现在，那时候的分配是非常平等的、平均的。
For instance, in many factories, the highest paid employees were veteran workers. They were not the party secretary or the factory manager or the chief engineer. They were veteran workers.
在工厂里边工资最高的是老工人，他不是什么技术员了，不是这个工厂的管理层就是老工人。
Not in every factory, but in many factories it was this way.
不是所有的，但是大多数工厂里边工资最高的都是老工人，而不是管理层。
Everyone lived in the same housing, in the same apartment blocks. They all shared the same.
住的单位都是住在这个工厂的这些这个家属区都住同样的房屋。
And their apartments were remarkably similar. They were based largely on how many family members you had.
大家住房的这空间呢，就取决于你家庭大小孩子多的住房空间多一些，孩子少的住房空间小一些。不管是干部还是工人这个大家都住在同样的这个居住条件，差别不大。
They went to the same health clinics. Their children attended the same schools. They rode their bicycles on the same bicycle paths to get to work.
大家不管是干部还是工人的孩子都上同样的学校大家都是骑着自行车在同样的路上上下班儿。
They also, during this period, they promoted what they called democratic management. And this meant, go ahead.
这期间呢，他们也推行了这个民主管理，在企业里边儿。
This meant two things in practice, I think. One, first of all, it meant self-management on the shop floor.
这里意味着第一步呢，就是在车间里边儿、基层里边儿是一个自我管理的机制。
Yeah. What this meant is that all workers were organized into small groups. The entire factory was organized into small groups. And these small groups met before work every day and after work every day to basically decide on what they were going to do every day, to take care of their own affairs. And they had different members of the group responsible for different tasks and different responsibilities.
这个工厂的小组呢，每天上班以前开个小组会，下班以后开个小组会讨论这个一天的工作或者将来做什么。
And the different individuals within the group had different responsibilities.
对，每个人呢在小组里有不同的这个职责任务。
Yeah. And they often elected, not all the time, but they often elected the leaders of these small groups, or at least they had a lot of influence on who these leaders might be.
对，这个小组长呢，往往是工人自己选出来的即便不是自己选出来的，他们的意向是得到尊重的。
The second thing that it meant in practice, democratic management meant in practice, was that workers were expected to exercise what they called mass supervision over factory cadres, factory leaders.
这种小组呢，它起到了一个对干部的监督的作用。它是不光是这个组织自己生产，它也过问企业的管理。
Now, mass supervision, this was not simply a slogan. It was a slogan, but it was not simply a slogan. It was the central authorities, the Communist Party was very, very concerned about controlling their own factory leaders. So the party authorities at the top were very concerned about controlling local leaders and local factory leaders.
这个群众监督不仅仅是一个口号虽然它也是个口号，但不仅仅是个口号。就是说这个党的这个上层呢，中央呢，对基层领导呢特别担心，需要群众去监督他们。
They were concerned about corruption and abuse of power and what they call bureaucratism and commandism and deviation from party policies by these local leaders.
他们担心的就是这个基层的这个干部呢腐败贪污或者是官僚主义或者是这个家长作风他们担心这个基层领导呢违背党的政策偏离党的路线。
Yeah. Now, the party was an extremely disciplined party, and they had strong levers of control from above through the party and the administrative bureaucracy.
这个党的组织性是非常强的，他们严格的这个上下级控制关系。
But they never considered this enough. They always considered that they had to have control from below as well in order to really control their cadres. They called this mass supervision.
但是他们知道这种党的这个上级党的领导还不够，他必须有这个群众的监督才能真正保证这个基层干部这个不走歪路。
They call this mass supervision. So, summing up, I think that during this work unit period, the workers enjoyed strong membership rights, but they had weak autonomy.
这段时间呢，这个总结起来看来呢，就是他有这个有铁饭碗但是呢，他的这个自主方面比较弱。
In terms of membership rights, they had permanent job tenure and they were considered legitimate stakeholders.
他们有这个铁饭碗，他们有这个确实属于这个企业的这个 利益相关的一部分。
On the other hand, they had weak autonomy because all of the factory organizations, including the organizations that were supposed to represent workers, were tightly controlled by the party.
但是他没有这个自主权比较弱，所有这个工厂的管理都是严格的控制，从上面控制着。
And especially during the 1950s, there were union leaders that made strong efforts to gain more autonomy for the local unions, and their efforts were stifled.
这个尤其是50年代，有一些工人的工会的领袖们，想给工人争夺更多的权利，他们的努力被压制了。
Also, the Staff and Workers Congresses, which were very active during many years, nevertheless, they were under the tight tutelage, the tight reign of the party.
这个职工代表大会，也起了很多的作用，但是他们也是受严格的管控的。
And all potential opposition was suppressed.
所有这个潜在的反对势力都被打压的。
But for the Communist Party itself, this was a problem. The heart of the problem, this lack of autonomy, was a problem. The real problem was, how could workers be expected to supervise factory leaders from whom they lacked autonomy?
所以一个很矛盾的状况就是这个既要群众监督，但是呢又限制他们的自主权，所以他很难真正有效的监督各级领导。
They tried to solve this problem. Particularly Mao tried to solve this problem because he was the one that initiated all mass movements in China during this period. He tried to solve this problem by implementing various mass movements, recurrent political campaigns, which were all aimed at empowering workers to exercise mass supervision.
这个毛主席呢特别担心，他特别希望通过群众监督去监督各级领导所以他呢就是发动了各个政治运动都是他发动的，去试图解决这个矛盾。
I see all of these mass movements during this period, during the Mao era, as experiments to try to introduce autonomy into mass supervision.
我的理解是这段时间毛泽东时代的一些运动，都是试图把这个群众监督这个自主权带到这个制度里边去。
So there's a whole series of mass supervision campaigns throughout the Mao era. The most important ones were these: the 3 Antis and the 5 Antis campaign in the early 1950s, the Party Rectification campaign in 1957, the Floor Cleans campaign in the early 1960s, and finally the Cultural Revolution in the late 1960s.
这里边群众运动呢分这几块，对吧？最早呢是这个3反5反，对吧？这些运动后来是这个57年的整风运动，然后呢后来是这个文革以前的四清运动，或者叫社会主义教育运动当然最有名的时间最长的是文化大革命了。
In the book, I look at each one of these in different chapters. The 1957 Party Rectification campaign was really the first. Oh, I skipped the 1952-53 campaign. Let me go back for just a bit. During the Sanfan Wufan campaign, during this period, before the Communist Party really had control of the factories, the nature of this campaign was mobilizing workers, both against the old factory managers and capitalists, as well as against the new cadres when they saw them as becoming corrupt. But the whole campaign, the question of autonomy was not that critical, because they looked at these campaigns largely as organized against the either the old managers or the corruption by the old managers and the capitalists of the party cadres. So the party could organize campaigns.
这个第一个就是那个3反5反运动，这里边呢党呢主要是 发动群众对付旧的过去的资本家、过去的这个资产阶级啊，也是对付一些新上任的一些干部的腐败问题。整个这个运动里边，这个群众监督自主权没有提到日程上来。
It wasn't that much of a concern to the party because they looked at it basically as organized against, not against the party leaders in the factory, but against the old leaders.
所以呢，这里边呢，党的这个关注的点就是对付过去的旧的统治阶级，所以呢，对党本身还没有提到议程上来，除了个别的贪污腐败的以外。
Now that changed after 1956, when really the factories were completely in the hands of the Communist Party, and Mao became very concerned about how to introduce some kind of autonomy in these mass supervision campaigns.
所以呢，但是到56年，这情况就变了，因为现在企业全部是在党的领导之下了，所以怎么对付基层的干部的这个腐败啊，这些问题啊，怎么去让工人有一些自主权去对付他们，是一个新的课题。
So this was really the first time in 1957 in a party rectification campaign. This was the first time that Mao encouraged freewheeling criticism of communist cadres from below.
这个整风运动是第一次，这个毛主席鼓励大家基层去批评自己本单位的领导，批评党的干部。
And this was one instance in which the union leaders pressed for more autonomy by the union, more autonomy that the union would have more autonomy from the party, from the local party leadership. And that the Staff and Workers Congress, this was a high point in the activities of the Staff and Workers Congress, and that the Staff and Workers Congress would have more autonomy from the Factory Party Committee.
这也是第一次，这个工会的领导和那个职工代表大会啊，他们的这个自主权挑战这个企业的这个党的这个领导是最高峰的时候。
And especially the Staff and Workers Congress, which was very active during this period.
这时候那个职工代表大会的是最活跃的时候。
And this was also a period when workers organized protests and strikes, the largest strike wave and workers' protest wave since the very early days of the communist era.
这时候呢，也是这个发生了过最大规模的工人的罢工运动就从这个解放以后第一次那么大规模的反抗运动。
But this experiment in autonomy and mass supervision was quickly aborted. And it was followed by the anti-rightist campaign, in which those who had raised their voices were suppressed.
然后呢，很快这个整风运动就被停止了转向到反右运动这个那些提意见的人都被打成右派。
Yeah, this was the party officialdom. The party just would not put up with this kind of campaign.
所以可以明显的看就是各级党的领导呢，对，很不愿，很看不上这整风运动，他们要捍卫自己的这个地位。
And that's what the anti-rightist campaign was about.
所以反右运动的本质就是捍卫这个官僚的自己的权利。
The next big campaign, it was a mass supervision campaign as well, was the Four Cleans campaign, or the socialist education movement in the early 1960s. Because of the real debacle that happened in 1957, Mao chose to go back to a more conservative, more conventional way of handling mass supervision campaigns.
然后再一次那个比较大规模的这个运动呢，就是社会主义教育运动了，4·7运动这时候呢，毛主席呢吸取了这个整风运动的这个失败的这个经验教训采取了一个比较保守一点的通过党的这个系统的派工作队的方法去发动这个群众的自发性。
Now, most of the work, most of the understanding of what the Four Cleans campaign was about has been about how it was carried out in villages. But actually, it was only carried out in a minority of villages, while I found that it was carried out in virtually every factory that had been established by this time.
四清运动，人们印象里边好像都是主要在农村啊。其实从我的调查来看，农村里边不是所有的村庄都经过了四清，但是所有的工厂都经过了四清。
And it was a very powerful movement. It lasted, oftentimes when a work team was sent into a factory, they stayed there for a year or more.
这个是一个非常强大威慑力的一个运动，因为这个工作队呢到一个工厂去，往往他一待就是1-2年。
When the work team arrived, they set the factory workers aside. The factory workers no longer, I'm sorry, not the workers, the leaders aside. And they no longer had any authority. The work team ran the factory.
工作组一来，他就把那个厂的领导呢就靠边站了，然后呢就是整个厂里的事务是靠工作组来做领导了。
Sometimes they allowed the factory leaders to manage production, but they took over the politics of the factory.
工厂的这个业务可以是过去的领导继续找，但是工厂的这个行政其他呢就完全变成工作组做了。
The work team recruited activist workers to join the what were called Four Cleans committees. They typically recruited workers that they did not think were very close to the old factory leadership.
工作组呢招收了一批这个工人呢参加工作队他们那个招的工人呢往往是跟过去厂领导不太靠近的工人。
And then they use these Four Cleans committees to mobilize all the workers systematically to criticize the factory leaders.
然后呢，通过这些工人呢，发动工厂里工人呢去批评过去厂的领导。
The whole way that the movement was organized was that workers participated under the leadership of the work team.
所以工人对这个企业的管理的参与呢，是通过工作组的条件下参与的。
Now, it was tightly controlled from above by these work teams, but that did not mean that this was a mild campaign. In fact, the workers I talked to all agreed that it was a very fearsome campaign.
这个四清运动呢，是一个严格控制的自上而下的但是不是一个无所谓的，它是一个影响非常严厉的。所有我采访的一些工人们都说这个是一个非常严厉的运动。
A small group leader in an electronics plant told me, I'll just let you read the Chinese.
这一个电子厂的小组组长他说每个人都必须毫无保留地发表意见，这不是自发的，而是像历史运动一样，气氛很严肃，每个人都很紧张，干部和工人都是非常凶，非常吓人。这次清理了干部的问题，我认为四清运动是最健康的运动。
An ordinary cadre in a steel mill told me.
但是另外一个普通干部，轧钢厂的普通干部说，领导们经历了非常艰难的时期，他们一遍又一遍地交代了自己的问题。所有中层干部都必须经历3天或者1周的洗澡下楼和顺手洗手，他们不得不承认自己的错误，并撰写自己批评的材料，那是非常不民主、非常残酷的。每个人都很恐惧，每个人都在担心我做错了什么。
Now you can see these are two very different points of view, but they both agree that this was a very fierce movement.
你可以看出来，这个工人和干部的感觉完全不一样但是呢，两个都是认同这是一个非常厉害的运动。
Yeah, and the communist cadres went through hell during this.
这个干部呢受了大的罪了
I think that the conclusions that I drew about the effectiveness of this movement, and it also in other people's scholarship, was that this movement was very effective in curbing cadre corruption.
这个从我的观察和其他的学者都比较一致的认为，就是这个运动呢，它的实际效果呢，就是有效的抑制了这个干部的腐败问题。
On the other hand, it was less effective in curbing cadres' bureaucratic tendencies, what they call bureaucratic tendencies.
但是对干部的这个官僚主义问题影响甚微。
Yeah. And this was actually the main concern, Mao's main concern. He was concerned about corruption, but he was much more concerned about these 官僚主义。
官僚主义所以呢，毛主席其实更关心的是官僚主义，对吧？毛主席说让群众去搞，不相信群众，只相信工作队不好。总之要依靠群众，不能依靠工作队。工作队不了解情况或者没有知识，有的做了官妨碍运动。这是毛主席65年一个讲话。
Right. This is when he's criticizing the methods of the Four Cleans movement because he doesn't think it's effective against the party cadre's bureaucratic tendencies.
毛主席对四清运动是有很批评的，他认为这种方法呢，并不能克服官僚主义问题。
By this time, he had really lost a lot of trust in the party officials. In the January of 1965, in the middle of the movement, he criticized the movement as ineffective, and this is what he said about the cadres of his own party.
就是说毛主席通过这时候已经看出来他对党的这个干部队伍的失去了信心，他对这个四清运动的方法非常反感。然后呢，他这样说：官僚主义者阶级以工人阶级和贫下中农是两个尖锐对立的阶级，这些走资本主义道路的领导人是已经变成或者正在变成吸工人血的资产阶级分子。他们对社会主义革命的必要性怎么会认识足呢？这人是斗争对象、革命对象，是实教运动绝对不能依靠他们。
So, in the middle of the Four Cleans movement, it still was not completed. The 14 Cleans work teams were still in the factories. He launched a very, very different kind of movement, the Cultural Revolution in 1966.
这个四清运动还没完毛主席等不及了，就要发动工人起来造反去反对官僚主义问题。
Yeah. He called on students first and then workers to form their own rebel groups. And the important thing about these groups is that they were autonomous from the factory leadership. There were no work teams now. He actually called for the withdrawal of the work teams and called on workers and students to organize their own rebel groups. They were autonomous from the party.
对他们这时候呢，就是不再是通过派遣工作组来搞运动了，他直接发动，先是学生，后是工人，成立自己的造反队去对付这个官僚主义问题。这个是完全自发的。
early period during the Cultural Revolution, where the big slogan that came from, it's actually Mao's, what he called his first big character poster, that he titled "Bombard the Headquarters." He meant the headquarters of his own party.
所以他呢，通过比如他炮打司令部他是直接对付自己的这个党发动群众起来反对党的一些干部。
Now, what happened in every factory is that the factory employees divided into rebel and conservative camps.
但是几乎所有的工厂都分裂成两派，一个保守派，一个造反派。
Yeah. The rebels attacked the factory leaders while the conservatives defended them.
这个造反派反对这个企业的领导，保守派呢捍卫企业的领导。
This was during the late 1966 and early 1967.
这是66年底到67年初的情况。
Now, in my estimation, the rebels were very effective agents of mass supervision.
从我的这个判断来看，这个造反派呢是一个非常有效的这个自我what do you say? Say it again.
They were very effective agents of mass supervision.
它是这个非常有效的这个群众监督的一个政体吧，一个agent. How do I say that?
我想不出来。
就是它是一个群众监督的最有效的载体。
对的。This was because they were self-organized. The leaders nominated themselves.
这里边因为他们是自我组织的，是自己生成自己的领导体系的，不是自上而下的。
in every workshop, the rebel individual workers who organized other workers to form small fighting groups.
所以在工厂里车间里边，工人自己联合起来组织造反派队伍。
And then these small fighting groups formed big coalitions.
这些小的战斗队呢，联合到起来变成大的这个一个团队。
They were also effective because they were led by workers. Some of these workers were rank and file party members, workers who were party members, and during this period, there were lots of workers who were party members, but they were also led by workers who had never joined the party.
这里边工人自己选举他们自己的带头人头们，这里边这个造反派的头们有的是这个党员，是基层党员，但也有好多从来没有入过党的。
Whether they were party members or they weren't party members, the nature of the rebels, what pulled them together, they're really key, what they were fighting for is they did not like the tight system of control under the party committee.
他们这个不管他是过去是党员还是不是党员，他们联合起来组织起来造反派的一个核心理念呢，就是特别对过去那种党的控制非常反感。
And they celebrated rebel spirit. This was really the main slogan of the rebels during the Cultural Revolution, borrowed from Mao's slogan of "To rebel is justified."
他们这里边呢，一个大家都一致赞同的就是造反精神弘扬造反精神这里是毛主席说的嘛，就是马克思主义的道理千条万绪，归根结底就是一句话：造反有理嘛。
During this period, Mao really promoted the slogan of big democracy. And by big democracy, he meant not institutionalized democracy, but rather rebellion and riots and revolutions.
所以呢，这里边呢就是一个大民主。这个大民主呢，不是制度化的民主，而是这个造反，是这个反抗，是一种这种就是what the three things he said is a riot, rebellion, and what?
Revolution.
革命，对，但是就是革命、造反和这个打破秩序那种民主的意思。
Yeah. The workers, they really grabbed onto the rebel workers. They really grabbed onto this slogan. It meant a lot to them. I'll let
所以对造反派的工人呢，他们特别sorry, say it again.
A shift leader this is on the shop floor of an electronics plant told me.
OK 就是造反派的工人呢，他们这特别这个认同这些。这是一个电子厂的班长呢说的，说因为以前害怕领导，所以不敢说，但是现在可以说实话了。你不用管领导怎么想了，他们都是走资派，他们已经没有权利了。
Okay. A railroad worker told me.
然后一个铁路工人告诉说，我们开会的时候，领导们都不敢说话，他们是被攻击的对象。但是保守派坚持认为党委没有犯过任何错误，群众之间也有争论。我们工作的时候、吃饭的时候、下班之后，无时无刻都在争论。
Now, this was an autonomous movement. It was largely autonomous from the party organization, but it was not as spontaneous.
这个是一个非常这个有自主性的一个群众运动，但它又不是完全自发的。
Right. The rebels were responding to Mao's call. They could not have risen up. They could not have organized themselves if it hadn't been for Mao's call.
他们是在毛主席的号召下的。如果毛主席没有号召，他们是不敢起来的。
Yeah. And they challenged the factory authorities, but they were loyal to Mao, or at least they tried to be loyal to Mao.
他们反对企业的领导层，但是他们是对毛主席非常忠诚的。
They strive to adhere to Mao's directives, although these sometimes were not very clear. This meant they focused on criticizing the cadres, but they opposed raising economic demands.
这里边呢，就是工人呢，他反对企业的领导，他按照响应毛主席号召，但是他们也反对这个提出经济主义的要求。
Yeah. That's what Mao wanted them to do. He insisted that they criticize the cadres, but they can't raise economic demands.
这也是毛主席让他们
This is a
反对基
poster
层
of
领
rebel
导，但
workers
是
writing a big character poster criticizing economism.
但是毛主席是反对这些经济主义要求的。这个大字报呢，就是工人造反派写大字报批判经济主义。
This movement has been characterized, and I think correctly so, as the top and bottom versus the middle movement. And Mao at the top and the workers at the bottom against the cadres in the party in the middle.
这一种说法就是说，这是毛主席在上边，工人在下边，一起对付中层。
Then, remarkably, in January of 1967, Mao called on the rebels to seize power.
然后很有意思，就是说毛主席在67年的这个1月份号召工人去夺权。
Now, what this led to, the party organization by that point, and especially after that point, the party organization was completely paralyzed. It didn't meet anymore. The party committee didn't meet anymore. The party organization was no longer active or functional inside the factories.
所以这时候呢，这个党的系统就完全瘫痪了，就是这个会也不开了，也没有权威了整个就是一个真空吧。
And factories fell into the hands of competing rebel factions and competing conservative factions.
工厂的领导权落在这个互相争斗的造反派和保守派的争夺中。
And this led to much more complicated and increasingly violent factional conflict.
这引起了这个越来越复杂的，有时是武斗这个打派仗和武斗。
Now, in the book, I do case studies of what happened in two provinces, in Hunan and Hunan, or Hubei. But and case studies, particularly of the cities of Zhengzhou, Luoyang, and Wuhan. I won't get into the details of those cities in this talk, but you can certainly ask questions later.
这里边呢，我专门去采访了几个地方，一个是郑州，一个是武汉，还有what are third city？ 洛阳，郑州、洛阳和武汉这里边那个书里边有细节这方面的东西。
Now, what became clear is that Mao never intended for the rebels to actually take power into their own hands.
但是其实毛主席从来没有说让造反派真正掌握权。
Instead, he eventually called for the organization of revolutionary committees.
但是他是鼓励的是成立的革委会这个对。
And these were composed of military officers that were dispatched to negotiate or to mediate between the cadres, the factory cadres, and the rebels.
这里边包括了这个军代表军代表呢是作为一个协调这个保守派和造反派之间的这一个起这么一个作用。
As well as a number of old factory cadres that were selected to be part of these revolutionary committees, and who were really the leaders of the rebel factions.
然后也包括过去厂里的这个一些领导，所以的三结合是军代表、工人代表和过去的领导干部代表。
What this led to in the end. Eventually, it was after a period of factional conflict for a couple of years. What it led to, they eventually organized revolutionary committees inside every factory, in every municipality, in every province. But what it led to in the end was military rule. The military officers really took power.
这里边呢，成立的革委会，工厂里边这个各个地区省市自治区都成立了革委会，但是这个最后造成一个军事化的管理时期。
And the military representatives who became in control of the factories suppressed the rebel organizations, and they also sidelined the old cadres.
这个军代表呢，变成了真正的权力中心，然后呢，他们的这个 去压制了造反派，也把这个当权派呢，就企业的当权派呢也靠边站。
Military rule, Mao and Zhou Enlai withdrew the military officers from the factories in 1972.
这个毛主席和周恩来呢，在72年呢就把这个军代表从这个革委会里边撤出去了。
This led to a very interesting period of institutionalized factional contention in China, which extended from 1973 to 1976.
这造成了一个非常复杂的、有意思的一个权力斗争的时期。
During this period, power was really divided between veteran party cadres who were in charge of the factories. They were brought back in and they were put in charge of the factories. The military representatives were now gone, and the veteran party cadres more or less ran the factories.
这样老干部呢恢复到原来的位置上了重新掌权。
Yeah. At the same time, former rebel leaders, some of them who were just released from jail or had been removed from leadership positions in the revolutionary committees, they came back now and they gained positions to supervise the old factory cadres.
这时候那些很多造反派的领袖们，有的从监狱出来了，有的是这个又恢复原来把他这个权力给剥夺了，现在又恢复他的权利了。他呢是在这个领导机关里边起到一个监督老干部的一个作用。
This meant they were put in positions, for instance, in leadership positions in the union, or in positions in the militia in the factory, or in positions in the propaganda apparatus of the factory.
这时候呢，这些造反派呢，他要么是这个民兵的这个主管的，要么是这个工会的主管的，要么是主管宣传的。
Or the militia.
Yeah, I said that. 民兵。
Yeah. Okay. This led to what people I interviewed referred this to the and also in the documents of the period, they referred to this as the old cadres against the new cadres.
这时候就变成一个老干部和新干部之间的矛盾。
And this factional contention, it really divided the party from the top to the bottom, from Zhou and Deng on one side in Zhongnanhai down to, and the Gang of Four on the other side at the very top, to the factions that extended all the way down to the shop floor at every level.
这样的话，就是这个新老干部这个矛盾呢，从中央，从周恩来那边到这个和四人帮，一直到这个基层都是新老干部的分裂。
And this was a period of alternating political winds, where all of this was modulated by Mao. He first supported the new cadres, and then he would support the old cadres.
所以这边呢，就是这个政治风向来回摆动，都是毛主席一会儿支持新干部，一会儿支持老干部。
So first he supported the new cadres, the old rebels, the rebel leaders, and they organized a criticized Lin Biao and Confucius campaign in 1973 and 1974.
然后这里边呢，就是一个代表，就是当时批林批孔，对吧？是针对老干部。
Then he supported when he thought the rebels had gone too far. He called on Deng Xiaoping to organize a rectification campaign in the party, which was directed at curbing the rebels' power.
但是呢，又发现新干部的又走歪了。毛主席动员这个让那个邓小平出面去搞整顿。
That was in 1975. And then when he thought Deng had gone too far in suppressing the rebels, then he supported the rebels in organizing what was called the Beat Back the Right Deviationist Win campaign in 1975 and 1976.
然后呢，那个75年是整顿，然后76年又是这个反击右倾翻案风。
Yeah. Eventually it led to the downfall of Deng Xiaoping.
最后邓小平又被罢官了就是说总结了，刚才没翻译完了，就是说他是这个先是整老干部，然后呢新干部走歪了，他又用老干部去整新干部，然后呢然后新干部又整老干部，反正来回折腾。
Yeah. This is a remarkable period, particularly all through this period. The old rebels would organize their own mass demonstrations, parades through the street, parades organized in factories. And the conservatives would organize the same kind of mass rallies and parades, both opposing each other.
所以这时候呢，这个工厂里边呢，各地方呢，出现了一个非常微妙的这种对立的情况。一会儿这个造反派呢又重新组织自己的队伍去游行示威，然后保皇派呢又组成自己的队伍去游行示威，双方对峙。
The most famous of these on the conservative side was, of course, the big rallies in April of 1976 to mourn Zhou Enlai.
当然，这个保守派的最大的一个活动就是76年的这个清明节4·5运动。
This whole period ended with Mao Zedong's death in September of 1976.
这个整个这个时期，毛主席去世以后就终结了。
Because the rebels completely depended on Mao Zedong's authority, and without it, they could not survive.
造反派完全依靠的是毛主席的这个威望，没有毛主席，他们就没有了，没权利了。
I look at the Cultural Revolution, this whole decade now, as a failed experiment in to try to develop autonomous mass supervision.
我是回顾这个文化革命的10年呢，就是一场呢自主性群众监督的失败的尝试。
It's really composed of two different periods. The first period you could call the period of the rebel movement from 1966 to 1969.
文革你可以分成两个这个时期，第一个时期呢就是66年到69年这造反运动时期。
Then I think that the rebel groups were really effective agents of mass supervision. They really were effective in challenging the factory leaders, and they permanently undermined their authority.
所以这时期呢，这个工人监督的是一个最有效的这么一个途径他们挑战了这个企业工厂的领导或者地方的这个领导他确实永久性的，就是说从这以后这个各级干部的这个权威望呢是彻底打破了。
And this situation lasted beyond 1976, beyond the Mao Zedong's death and the end of the rebel movement. They really permanently altered the power between the workers and the cadres in factories, strengthening the power of the workers and weakening the power of the cadres.
这段时间的影响呢是永久性的，就是说它不光是在69年以后甚至在毛主席去世以后也是，就是这个党群关系，这干部和群众的关系呢也完全改变了。
The rebels, this was possible because the rebels were autonomous from the factory leadership, but their autonomy was limited by their dependence on Mao.
这里边那个造反派他的这个威望呢，主要是因为他们为什么有效，是因为他们是独立自主的，但是他们又是这个威慑力完全取决于对毛主席的依赖。
It was also limited because they were only allowed a momentary existence.
而且他们的为什么有效是有限的？这个他们的影响力是有限的，是因为他们只允许暂时的存在。
The second period of the Cultural Revolution, beginning in 1973, or the second interesting period, beginning in 1973 and lasting through Mao's death in 1976, this period of institutionalized factional contention.
然后这个第二个时期呢，就是从73年到76年这几年呢是一个制度化的派系斗争。
This was an unprecedented period of factional contention within the system. Nothing like this had existed before the Cultural Revolution, and nothing like this existed after the Cultural Revolution.
这种制度化的这个派系斗争呢是前所未有的，以后也没有就是这个是一个非常独特的时期。
But during this whole period, both the factions basically had very limited autonomy, the rebel faction in particular.
整个的时期呢，就是造反派其实没有很多的自主权。
And then the experiment ended altogether with the purge of the radical faction following 1976.
这个呢，最后呢，这个造反派的被清洗，这个76年以后呢，就结束了这个尝试。
The early reform era was a very interesting period as well, from 1977, when after the rebels were purged from the party, through the early 1990s. During this period, Deng Xiaoping was in charge of the party.
从77年到92年是一个非常有意思的时期。这里边呢，这时候邓小平是主政的时期。
Deng restored the monocratic political system. He got rid of factionalism altogether in the party.
他
got rid of these two big factions in the party.
他把这个派系给去敌了然后呢就统一了党。
At the same time, he enhanced the formal mechanisms of workers' participation inside factories.
Wait a minute, you said he get rid of two factions. How did he get rid of both factions? I don't understand.
Well, no, he got rid of this factional contention by eliminating the rebel faction.
OK, yeah. 他这个消除了党内的这个派系斗争就是通过把造反派给去敌完成的但是呢他也在工厂里边这个实施了一些民主化的这个改制。
This was also a period of cautious market reforms. These were cautious reforms because the basic elements of the work unit system remained in place.
这时候也开始一些谨慎的这个市场改革。这里边呢，这个单位制并没有改变，单位制还是以前的样子。
The key elements or the key characteristics of the work unit system were that all enterprises were public property and that workers still had permanent job tenure.
这里边呢，仍然保持这个全民所有制，然后呢，这个工人仍然还有铁饭碗。
And workers also retained during this period substantial influence inside factories.
这时候呢，工人在工厂里边还是有很大的这个发言权、参与权。
Many workers remembered this, as well as cadres, remembered this as the golden age of the Staff and Workers Congress.
很多工人和干部都把这个时期看成是工人代表大会的一个这个黄金时期。
Now, the Staff and Workers Congress had a very unstable history. It had existed since before 1949. Wherever the Communist Party took over factories, they established Staff and Workers Congresses. They were very active during the 1950s. They were very active in 1957. They were not active during the Great Leap Forward. Then they were very active again in the early 1960s. They were closed down during the early years of the Cultural Revolution and replaced by workers' congresses, which were run by the rebels.
就是这个职工代表大会制度呢，是有几经起伏早期在这个解放以前呢，这个凡是工人党这个参与的这个工人运动，都是搞这个职工代表大会的，所以他们在50年代初也是非常这个非常这个活跃的然后呢，他们在这个57年的整风的时候是活跃的在60年代初期活跃过一阵儿然后呢，文化大革命一开始呢，又被这个造反派给替代了然后呢，这个改开以后又开始活跃起来。
Actually, they were restored. They had workers' congresses that the rebels ran, and then they were restored in the early 1970s, but they were never really institutionalized until after Deng came back to power.
What do you mean by institutionalized? They were restored, but not institutionalized. What does that mean?
Well, when they brought back the trade unions in 1973, they also brought back the Staff and Workers Congress. But because the factional contention in factories was so sharp, they never really, in many factories, they didn't meet that often. But after 1979, really, when Deng called on new regulations, which required every factory to have Staff and Workers Congress meet twice a year.
就是说这个 文化大革命中呢，这个职工代表大会基本上都被造反派给占了。然后呢，这个改开以后呢，这个对，文化革命中呢，其实职工代表大会不在70年代初期，职代会、工会和职代会都恢复了，但是呢，因为派系斗争啊，职代会其实因为都是打派仗，所以没法真正开职代会啊。那么是这个改开以后呢，又恢复了职代会。
So it was arrived after 1978, and during this period, it had substantial formal powers. In fact, it was supposed to be the organization that ran the factories. The factory leaders all had to get approval for everything from the Jirdai Hui. And during this period, they also carried out new experiments in factory elections.
这时候呢，这个78年开始，这职代会恢复工作，然后这里边呢，职代会确实在有些地方呢，名义上呢是最高权力机构了它是有实权啊，然后呢还在这一段时间呢，还实施了很多工厂的这个基层的选举。
Yeah, they had experimented with factory elections all through the Mao era as well, particularly during the Cultural Revolution. But this time it was more institutionalized and more widespread than it had been.
这个厂内的选举制度啊，在毛泽东时代也尝试过但是呢，不像这时候搞得那么制度化的选举。
So it was very active in the early 1980s. But at the same time, it was very much under the factory leaders' tutelage.
所以一方面，这个职代会是非常活跃，在80年代早期非常活跃，但是呢，又是始终在党的在工厂领导的这个指导下控制下的。
Nevertheless, it became an important vehicle for workers' influence, and the Jirdai Hui meetings were held regularly, and they had long meetings that sometimes lasted for even weeks. And they deliberated, especially questions of welfare provision, which they didn't really deliberate that much during the Mao era, particularly housing.
这个职代会的这个有时候开会开得很长，有时候开1-2个月反正好几周这里边职代会里边讨论的问题呢，很多都跟工人的福利直接有关系，尤其是住房问题。
But they were weakened in the late 80s, in the late 1980s, by the enterprise reforms that were begun to carry out in the late 80s, which involved strengthening the power of the factory director and also starting to hire workers on a contract basis.
然后这个80年代后期呢，就强调了这个厂的领导的这个一厂制。然后呢，这个好多有些工人呢，开始是一种合同工这些东西都削弱了这个职代会的这个威力，职代会的这个作用。
Old workers still were permanent workers, but the new workers were hired. They didn't have a permanent status.
老工人有这个铁饭碗，但是新工人呢就变成合同工了。
But the big blow came after 1992 with industrial restructuring, and that began really Southern Tour in 1992.
最大的这个改变呢，是来自于这个72年不是这92年邓小平这个南巡讲话。
It was really institutionalized by two laws, the company law in 1994 and which developed what was called the modern enterprise system. Under this law, all enterprises were supposed to maximize profits, including state-owned enterprises, and minimize labor costs.
这时候呢，就有2个法案，就是说所有的这个现代公司法，就是说不管是国营的、私营的，都是要这个利润最大化作为标准。
Yeah. And they strive to replace the 3 old committees with the 3 new committees. The 3 old committees were the Party Committee, the Union, and the Staff and Workers Congress. And the 3 new committees were the Shareholders Committee, the Board of Directors, and the Supervision Committee.
所以他们把过去的3会改成新的3会，过去是党委会、 工会和支代会，现在变成了董事会。What's the three in English?
Shareholders.
Board directors 对
Board of directors, right?
对一个是董事会，一个是这个股民的这个代表大会，还有一个监委会。
The second law was the labor law in 1995, and this opened the way. This ended permanent job tenure forever. It opened the way for massive layoffs.
然后呢，95年劳动法呢，正式废除了这个铁饭碗就是所有的这个工人都变成了这个合同工。
This whole period of industrial restructuring was a period of tremendous conflict in Chinese factories, and the staff meetings became venues for sharp conflict.
带着非常严厉的这个尖锐的冲突。
And the Staff and Workers Congress were really in the middle of this because they were expected to organize or to approve the employee reallocation plans, which meant layoffs.
这时候职代会呢起了一个很关键的作用，因为它所有这个职工再就业等等都要经过职代会的这个批准，名义上是说。
So there were conflicts within the Staff and Workers Congress meetings, within the institutions of the factory. There were also huge street protests, including sit-ins.
这时候也是不光是职代会里边争论的很激烈，而且这个很多的市场就是这个街头的这抗议非常严厉。
The chapter on industrial restructuring, I do a case study of what I call the brilliant glass factory. But I'm not going to discuss the details of how it was taking place there.
这有个案例，就是一个耀华玻璃厂的一个案例，这个分析在书里边有具体的研究。
These battles over industrial restructuring are continuing to this day, and workers have won temporary victories and partial victories. They've often postponed industrial restructuring. They postponed layoffs, but they could not stop this restructuring juggernaut.
这种国企改制这个工人的斗争呢，也推迟了、延缓了，但是无法阻止这个国企改制的推进。
As a result, tens of millions of workers were laid off. 60 million workers just in a few years in the late 1990s.
6000万这个工人下岗，这90年代末期6000万这个工人下岗。
And the layoffs have continued since then.
而且这个失业这种现象直到今天仍然存在。
And it established a tiered employment system with a shrinking core of veteran workers who are really getting old and waiting to retire. And a growing periphery, those are the workers that survive the layoffs, and then a growing periphery of precarious workers that just come and go.
这现在造成了一个这个两个层次的工人，一是老工人，在体制内的老工人，他们慢慢虽然退休了，然后呢，新工人全部是任何保障都没有的。
And it's given rise to a system of factory labor which features very long hours and much more intensive labor.
造成了这个劳动时间的非常长，然后强度是非常大这都是现在的现状。
It's led to much more coercive industrial relations.
这个劳资关系呢是非常紧张。
The small teams really no longer meet. Sometimes they exist on paper, but they really no longer meet. Now the small team leader is certainly not elected by the workers. There's a big gap between the leaders and the workers, and they enforce discipline through fines and threats of discharge.
所以这个职代会呢也没有什么权利，现在这基本上不再开什么会了，然后这个劳资关系厂方有这个强烈的这个制裁工人的权利
And the Jirdao pay itself continues to decline. And they're supposed to have 知代会 in every factory still, including the private factories, but they don't really exist. They only exist on paper in the private factories. And in the public, most factories are private now. They've been privatized or they're new private factories. And even in the state-owned factories that continue to exist, the Staff and Workers Congress, if it meets at all, and in many it doesn't, these are irregular, short, and very formalistic meetings.
所以现在这个知代会在纸面上是所有的企业必须都有的但是它在国企里边现在也是很少起作用，然后呢，私企里边基本上就一张白纸。
The situation in factories today was described to me by a couple of employees in a privatized fiberglass reinforced plastics company. This was a part of one division of this glass company that was privatized. A veteran worker who had worked there for 27 years saw all of the big changes. He told me,
Right. 就说这一个过去这个玻璃纤维这个厂的工人呢，他建立了所有这些这个经历。他说，现在谁敢说呀？企业是私人的，老板愿意雇你，他就雇你；他要是不愿意就不用你。以前你还能提意见，说句老实话，现在他们不让你说，就让你干活。以前还有点讨论空间，企业改制以后，现在就是工作干完就完了。
On the other hand, the deputy director of the factory, much younger, he was the deputy director. He was also the second largest shareholder, and he was the union chair, which tells you something about the nature of the union. Of the same factory, he told me.
另外一个人呢，这个人呢是工会这个主席，而且是第二大股东他呢说，普通工人对企业一无所知，尤其是合同工，他们脑子里也不想那么多，就是工作挣钱。普通工人不能很好的表达他们的想法，跟我们不一样，我们看问题的角度不一样，我们了解情况，我们更了解情况所以你可以对比看两边的这个态度看法。
Yeah, you can see from both of them they have very different perspectives, but they're describing the same situation in which the workers no longer have any power in the factories.
所以他们两个的视角完全不一样，但是他们看到的是同一个问题，就是工人没有什么权利。
So, summing up the main account of the book, the main message of the book, I would say that the work unit system was never really a model of democracy.
总结起来讲，就是供需那个单位制不是一个民主的范例。
On the other hand, workers enjoyed strong workplace membership rights. They were considered members and legitimate stakeholders, and therefore they had substantial influence, especially on the shop floor.
所以这个单位制呢，给了工人一个非常极强的这个工厂的成分，给他们也制度保障，所以他们有话语权。
At the same time, they had very weak autonomy. The union and the Staff and Workers Congresses were under the factory leaders' tutelage.
但是他们这个自主权，职工的自主权是非常弱的他们基本上不管是工代会工会都在厂的领导指导下工作的。
And the experiments that Mao initiated to try to increase the autonomy of the workers, these experiments were quickly aborted.
但是毛主席做的一些尝试，就是关于这个企业民主管理的这东西，基本上都被停止了。
And without autonomy, it was really, without the workers having a strong level of autonomy, it was impossible to really develop democracy.
当然没有工人的这个自主权，它是不会实现民主的。
On the other hand, after industrial restructuring, what industrial restructuring did was completely revoke the industrial citizenship or industrial membership.
这个国企改制呢，就彻底的这个摧毁了这个销售工人的这个成分，在这个企业里边的成分。
It once again reduced work unit members to hired hands.
基本上工人就变成打工人了。
And just as Andrew Walder predicted, it did diminish their dependency on the factory.
就像那个学者说呢，这个工人没有对企业没有任何依赖了。
At the same time, it severely eroded workers' power.
同时也把工人的这个权利完全给消除了。
what's going to happen in the future is very hard to predict.
将来会变成什么是很难预计的。
There's certainly large numbers of strikes and protests by workers in China today.
当然这个工人的运动、工人的罢工活动等等还是非常普遍的，非常这个多的。
Perhaps fewer today than a few years ago, but they're still very strong.
这个工人运动虽然今年
Now, it's possible that workers through these kind of conflicts may regain a degree of job security. This is what a lot of workers are striving for, is to have some more job security than they've had in the past or in the recent past. Hoping I can no longer hear you. I don't know if anyone can hear me. But I'll just conclude that if they don't regain a level of job security, they'll be in a weak position to really demand more say in factory affairs.
I was being silenced for a while, so I couldn't. All right. I forgot what you said earlier.
Okay. I said that with workers carrying out this kind of struggle, one of their main demands is to regain a degree of job security.
所以现在工人的斗争呢，就要求是增加自己的这个就业这个稳定性。
But unless they do, they'll really be in a weak position to demand more say in factory affairs.
是他们没有就业的这个保障的话，他们对企业的这个发言权就不会有。
So that's my presentation. It's the main content of my book, or the main narrative of my book.
这是他的这个主要这本书的总结吧。
I have to thank Yan Хэpina for great translation. It's really fantastic. And
no, I just read your PPT. That's all. 好，
I'll unshare.
OK。那么下一步呢？我去谈谈对这个周安东的这本书的一些这个想法和看法啊。我就简单的发言，现在时间不多了，还可以留给大家一些时间去提问题，所以呢非常紧张啊。我想头讲两个问题，第一个问题是流动性和主人这个关系啊，对，就是说这个他批判那个学者就说这个单位制度呢是使得这个工人呢变成一种依附关系啊，但是呢就是说工人阶级当家做主被这个学者看成依附关系，对吧？所以我举个例子说，你如果买了个房子啊，你能不能把你自己的房子随便带到你想去的地方，对吧？按照这种说法的话，租客才是最自由的人，对吧？你不喜欢你的房子，你是卖掉换一个房子呢，还是装修把它修好啊？你不喜欢你的单位，是调动单位呢，还是改变它啊？人们要自由，但是自由与义务是对立的啊，对等的啊。我相信在这个在就业自由与主人公地位的这个选择上啊，世界上绝大多数的打工人首先要选的是主人公地位啊，然后才有就业的自由啊。毛泽东时代呢，对就业自由的限制呢，是一种不得已的权宜之计啊。I don't bother translate for you. I send you the paper later.
You speak very clearly.
OK. 第二个就是说，工人阶级如何才能当家做主啊？这个文革中的派系斗争说明了工人阶级只有学会了正确的划分和处理两类不同性质的矛盾，才有可能当家做主啊，打败仗，对吧？这就不会当家做主。80年代群众运动被驱敌以后才兴起来的职工代表大会制度，其实和南斯拉夫的所谓的工人自治制度是一样，它是一个倒退，是一个分化瓦解工人阶级 作为一个自为阶级的，获得阶级意识的一个中间步骤啊。南斯拉夫的经验证明啊，工人群众对单个企业的参与权越提高，对国家的管理权反而是越丧失，工人就越是从自己的福利出发，而不是从社会主义道路还是资本主义道路出发去看问题。也就是说，工人从阶级利益的全局利益出发，还是从自己或本企业的局部利益出发来看待单位的领导或者国家的领导啊？乍看呢，工人自治企业里的工人有着管理一个企业的权利，但是他同时就丧失了管理其他企业乃至国家的权利啊。工人自治企业就不再是全民的啊，这类企业之间的关系最后只能是资本主义的关系。全民所有制是不允许一个企业的工人单独决定厂里的关系、权利的一切的。其他工厂的工人也有权过问啊，比如说文化大革命中千万个工人之间互相串联的例子啊。那么资本主义条件下，工人也有你这儿罢工我支持，那儿罢工我但是那是捍卫工人权利的，它是不对企业管理进行干涉的啊。所以呢，这个文化革命中工人那种串联支持，它是反对所谓企业自治的。所以企业自治呢，其实剥夺了工人过问其他工厂事业的权利啊。下一步呢，就被厂里的能人剥夺管理企业的权利啊。企业内部哪个人能把企业搞好，他就会成为企业的领导。对外能在市场经济中打破对手，不断扩张的企业领导，对内必然也是无敌的啊。既然这种领导是按照资本主义的逻辑进行市场运转，它也必然一步一步的剥夺企业内部工人监督它的可能。工人自治的企业就必然一步步的成为名副其实的资本主义的企业。所以从这可以看见，就是说面对资本主义的压迫，工人群众希望通过自治来缓解资本主义的奴役，这种进步要求是可以理解的。但是指望这种所谓外圆内方的原则来避免资本主义的统治，只能是一种不切实际的幻想。它如同所有工联主义和一切改良主义的愿望一样，有它的局限性，它不会从根本上威胁资本主义的制度啊。所以呢，这里边呢一个最根本的问题呢，就是说啊，我们要看到，就是说所有制向来是第一位的，民主向来是第二位的啊。丧失了无产阶级专政，也就丧失了工人阶级的民主权利啊。文革中的派性，改革开放后的职工代表大会制度，南斯拉夫的工人自治制度，都有一个共同的特点，都是从个人小集团利益出发的啊。只有从全体利益出发的工人阶级，才是一个真正的自为的阶级。好，就说这么点，所以我把这个安卓的这个讲座呢，给我们把这个历史呢讲得非常清楚。我们看到了这个工人阶级地位怎么从一个往上升啊，然后呢怎么一步步在文化大革命试图去掌握自己的命运啊，但是由于自己的派系斗争呢，没有能够正确处理啊这个两类不同性质的矛盾，最后造成工人阶级最后丧失自己当家作主的权利。这个整个这个过程讲的是非常明确的。好，我不多浪费时间，咱们留下这个咱们留下一个时间呢给提问。All right, that's all I'm gonna say for this.
我能不能回答一下？
当然你能回答。
Okay, I think your summation of the same period of time is also very profound and very. I think you hit on a lot of things that I didn't put it exactly that way. You put it in a somewhat different way. Now I would put it in a somewhat different way again. I think during the Mao era, workers were really invited to participate politically and make political demands. And that was very important, this mass supervision over cadres, and to really make sure the Communist Party was on the continued to be, this was the Mao era, make sure the Communist Party was still on track.
就是说，你的这个视角跟我的视角都是非常讲的是一个非常核心的东西啊。那么我来看呢，就是毛泽东时代呢，它是一个毛主席想让这个工人群众去真正的参与这个企业的管理啊 ，something like that.
But it's political. What they
是
could
政治上的，对，
participate in was political. They could not make economic demands. They were really constrained in making economic demands.
所以工人呢，是让他去在政治上去参与，但是呢，不允许他们做经济上的这个要求。
And that's what changed during the 1980s then. All the political movements, that was the end of the political movements. Once Mao was gone, there were no more political movements that workers could participate in, which they had throughout the Mao era. But now, they were absolutely not allowed to really make political demands or exercise any kind of real mass supervision over cadres, but they were allowed to make economic demands.
所以在改
They
革
could
以
focus
后
on economics and absolutely not on politics.
Yeah, okay, let me translate, otherwise I forget. 改开以后呢，工人呢，不允许提出政治上的要求了，政治上的监督了，不能监督领导了，但是他可以提经济上的要求啊，所以跟毛泽东时代正好是相反。
And then after industrial restructuring, I think their power was greatly reduced altogether, and they really had no effective institutionalized way of making their power felt.
然后那个国企改制以后呢，这个他们的这个影响力进一步的削弱，他们没有一个制度化的去连经济上要求都提不到了。
On the other hand, it doesn't mean workers have no power today. It's greatly diminished from the past, but their power today it's really not institutionalized at all. It's like it is when workers are unorganized in a lot of countries around the world, but they still have the power to protest and strike, and they still the state and the management still has to make concessions.
就是说工人现在就是像世界好多地方，他没有一个制度化的一个去提出自己要求的这个渠道，但是呢，工人通过罢工，通过这个野猫了，这个各种抗议活动呢，它也使得这个企业的管理层和国家的管理层不得不考虑工人的要求。
That's it.
就这么多。
So look forward to other folks' questions. We don't have much time left.
感谢安州老师和杨和平老师。然后现在我们选了3个问题。第一个问题是，群众自主的运动如何保证由工人自发主导，而不被官僚或者工人厂长利用，被他们掌控群众运动？就是说，毛应该也意识到了这个问题，他是如何保证群众运动不会由官僚或领导利用呢？
You're saying if Mao supported these mass movements, but couldn't they be misused in some ways by the leadership, of the local leadership? That's the essence of your question, as I understand it. It certainly was, and none of these mass movements were. There had tremendous contradictions in each one. Certainly, like the switching movement, the 社会教育运动. This was run by the cadres, and they used it for their purposes. And there was also, in each factory, there were conflicts among different groups of cadres. In fact, there were conflicts among factions within ministries and within municipalities. They got all tied up in these, in the switching movement. Okay. And it was almost inevitable movements that were run. Okay, go ahead.
就是说，这些都是个确实实际的问题。就是说，在毛泽东时代，你搞运动，然后这里边呢，就是说，所有的人呢，都想把这个运动按照自己的意志去扭转朝那个方向啊，所以呢，怎么去改变这个很难。
Yeah. But workers could really use these movements to, they were designed by Mao to give workers more power to exercise mass supervision, and they were nevertheless.
Too long, so I forget a lot of stuff. 所以你像这些运动，像四清运动啦，什么文革啦，好多都是毛主席想给给予人民这种自主权利去。但是呢，这里边呢，所有人呢都很难。这里边what's your key? Can you say your key point?
My key point would be that certainly these movements are used by everybody, as you translated more correctly than I said it. They're used by everybody for their own purposes. And the
这不可避免，
leaders
就这种
can
东西被人利用是不可避免的。这个没有什么这个好办法。
But because they were really designed by Mao, his intention was to allow workers to have more power to supervise cadres. The workers could use these movements for that purpose. And that was especially true during the Cultural Revolution when they had more autonomous power.
这毛主席呢，就是发动这种运动呢，就是想让群众有更多的这个话语权所以呢，工人、人民群众呢，工人也是充分的利用了这些机会去这个去把自己这个看法表达出来
But the Cultural Revolution in particular was a very complicated movement.
文化大革命是一个最好的例子，但是也是个极其复杂的这个运动极其复杂的运动。下一个
With lots of interest groups representing lots of different interests in conflict.
对各种派系、各种思想意识形态全表现出来了。
第二个问题是，第二个问题是，industrial citizenship 就是产业公民的概念起于布尔什维克革命左右，但是在20世纪末，国际共运退潮之后，这个概念就几乎消亡了。就是说，为什么在国际共运退潮之后，全球对于 industrial demography 就是产业民主的讨论事件为什么会如此快速的消失？就是说，资本主义国家内部，社民派系对于工人民主的努力与社会主义国家中建立了这样的工人民主文化，为什么会在一朝一夕之间这样迅速的轰然崩塌呢？
The concept of the industrial citizenship was initiated in the Bolshevik Revolution, and then but how come they disappeared so fast after the collapse of the socialist camp? And the whole concept, well, how come the social democracy doesn't have this same concept? 是这意思吗？
对，就是说，简单来说，就是说，为什么社会主义对于民主这样的一种文化的这样一种建立，在短时间内就迅速的消失了，或者说这种民主文化、这种运动文化就这样崩塌掉了。
是资本主义社会里边还是社会主义社会里边的民主崩溃了？我没听太清楚。
是两个方面，就是说，资本主义国家内部也有社民派。有这样的民主的努力，然后社会主义国家内部也有这样的对于这样一种运动民主运动这样一种努力，就是这两个就是随着这样一种共产主义运动的这样一种退潮，不管是资本主义国家内部和社会主义国家内部这样一种运动式的都这样迅速的这样一种消失了。就这个原因是不是可以老师能提供一些想法？
I think that's a very important point that I want to make, is that this whole period I think the period of industrial citizenship was global in some ways. But the reason it was there was, like you correctly pointed out, it came from the socialist revolutions. After the Bolshevik Revolution, that was led to the rise of it, both because of the workers' movement in the capitalist countries and also because the capitalists were willing to make concessions during that period in order to compete with socialism in some ways, compete with the threat, meet the challenge of socialism.
就说这个你讲的是对的，就说这个工业叫企业叫 industrial citizenship 工业公民制度，这个其实是社会主义运动推出来的。而资本社会呢，他们为了和社会主义竞争，他们也不得不做一些妥协，这些概念也被利用了Go ahead.
Li Yong, they had to meet the challenge of socialism in some ways. And they had to meet the challenge of the workers' movement that were inspired by socialism. The workers' movement was much stronger while these socialist countries existed than it had been before, or certainly than it has been since.
因为社会主义运动的存在挑战着资本主义制度，所以资本主义国家呢，它必须面对这种挑战，它必须做出改变，做一些调整啊。但是呢，随着社会主义制度的这个国家的消失呢，他们就再也不会考虑这些问题了，不在乎了。
Yeah, after I think the reason neoliberalism could rise was because socialism was declining, was because socialism was becoming weaker, particularly in the Soviet Union, but then everywhere, including in China during the 1980s.
这个新自由主义的出现呢，很大程度上也是因为这个社会主义的这个衰落啊，在苏联，后来在中国，所以呢，新自由主义可以在全球这个泛滥。
It no longer had to meet this challenge, so it could go as it naturally would want to go.
所以他们没有这个社会主义挑战，他们就可以随心所欲的疯狂的这个扩张。
And the workers' movement around the world no longer had this kind of model of really challenging the capitalist model, and so the workers' movement also became much weaker.
也是因为这个没有一个这个灯塔，没有一个榜样。去这个鼓励这个工人运动，所以工人运动呢也走向衰落啊。社会主义的这个衰落是全球性的影响。
So this is all a global. The events around the globe are very closely connected.
所以这些都是全球都互相影响的，都互相联系着。
第三个问题是为什么在文革期间，造反派反对官僚制？呼吁自主权的行动，但是却又不得不依靠对于毛的权威，这是不是与中国的家长制传统有关？是不是正是这一点为这一场运动的失败埋下了根基
？I think the reason the workers never had independent power. They never had their own independent organization that they could rely on. They had to rely, the only way they could organize independently at all was because Mao called on them to. And so when the Communist Party was tremendously strong, including the local leadership of the party, and they would not allow a kind of autonomous organization of workers. That was decided in the 50s when they suppressed the union efforts to be more independent.
就是说就是矛盾时代了，这个工人的自主性呢，其实完全很大都依赖着毛主席鼓励他们去造反，他们能造反但是他们任何这个脱离的这个党的领导、党的体系，另外的自己的这个政治体系是不允许存在的，所以呢这个依赖性是确实存在。
I think this was a problem of the whole Marxist-Leninist model. From the Soviet Union on through China, where there really was no room for autonomous workers' organization.
他说这是整个就是列宁主义的这个体系里边是不允许独立先锋队之外的一个政治体系，工人自己的一个独立的政治体系存在的。
Now it was very necessary because to make a revolution, to make a socialist revolution was such a big challenge to the status quo, to the capitalist order, or the existing order. The party had to be extremely disciplined, extremely organized, and it could not have factional conflict or a tremendous amount of democracy with people going their own way and making their own decisions. And so this was the model that succeeded in making these kind of revolutions.
所以这个社会主义革命是依靠着这个列宁先锋队的这个理论这种制度成功的，它是高度统一的、高度纪律性的所以这种制度成功的，所以它不会允许其他的跟它竞争的。Is that what you mean?
Yeah, but then after the revolution, this is a weakness, I think, of the model, is that it really couldn't maintain. It became bureaucratized. And that was bureaucratized in part because it was not, it didn't allow enough democracy from the grassroots.
然后的制度成功以后呢，就是他们 越来越官僚化，所以它没有一个能够允许其他的这个挑战者存在的这么一个空间啊，越来越官僚化。
Yeah. I think the only antidote to bureaucratism, which is what did these parties in and did socialism in, was having more democracy at the grassroots, having more actually being able to do mass supervision from below, and that just was not possible within this model.
真正要找出路，就是要有基层的民主化，才能克服这种官僚主义啊。I know time is up.
Yeah.
这个观点呢，you done with what you're going to say? Because time is really almost done.
Yeah. No, that's it. I think that Mao really attempted to deal with this problem with the Cultural Revolution, but ultimately he didn't find a solution that really worked.
毛主席想解决这个问题，通过文化大革命，最后还是失败了那是他的观点这个问题上呢，我有不同的看法，就是说这个工人阶级要当家做主他离不开自己的先锋队就是说很多人说是用这个什么工人无产阶级的多党制，比如说对吧？但是工人阶级有个他要当家做主，他必须有一条，就是从权击利益出发他从阶级的长远的权击利益出发。那么这些从长远权击利益出发的人分裂为不同的党派，本身就是不是无产阶级的所以这里边呢就是一个列宁主义的问题，有人把这官僚出现认为是这个列宁主义的问题造成的，我不同意这观点这个社会主义时期存在着一个最根本的矛盾，就是党的领导和群众监督的问题这个问题呢，不能通过去敌群众监督，也不能去敌党的领导来解决这个问题官僚主义的问题本质上实际上就是一个官僚体制向谁负责的问题官僚的存在是社会化大生产的必然结果，因为工人阶级要管理国家，他必须有一个职业的专业的会管理整个计划经济的体系的人，不是任何人都能胜任的。那么问题不在官僚的出现，问题在这些人向谁负责？资本家、老板这个大财团，他雇佣专业的管理人员，这些人向他负责。工人阶级也同样的要想办法能使得专业的管理人员向工人阶级负责所以官僚的本身它是社会化大生产的必然结果好时间不多了，没有时间去去讨论这个问题了没办法但是就说这个问题呢，要懂得这个问题，就必须研究文化大革命的整个全过程这个里边呢所有的关于社会主义应该怎么做的理论，都必须通过文化大革命的具体过程捋一遍，看你那个理论，你那种说法在文化大革命怎么遇到了什么样的障碍实际结果是什么？人们可以想象各种东西，但是最后人是世界上最复杂的，每个人都有自己的想法，你有任何顶层设计，底下都会有自己的对策所以阶级斗争有它的客观规律不是以任何人的意志为转移的，所以要研究这个社会主义社会，就得踏踏实实的研究阶级斗争的客观规律。好 ，That's my spiel
感谢安州教授和杨和平老师。那我们今天的讲座就到这里了感谢安州教授。
你把安州静音了你把安州静音了。
我看看
You're not allowed to speak anymore. They silence you. They're afraid you're going to speak something.
现在您是主持人。
I cannot hear you.
杨老师现在您是主持人。
那我怎么让他讲话呀？好了，
他可以说话，他可以说话。
我已经可以。
你现在可以说话了。
好最后一次。The last statement you made, I completely agree with. And I think that's absolutely true. We've got to understand what happened with the socialism and what's the way forward. You have to very carefully study the Cultural Revolution in China.
Yeah.
There are lots of other things we can debate, and we need to debate. And there's lots of room for debate.
Right.
But I absolutely agree with. And I think that's a starting point for that debate.